Jewelry Bonney has turned out to be one of the most enigmatic characters in One Piece, and if you haven't been keeping up with the discourse over the past few chapters, there's one question in particular that has been at the center of every conversation. Just how old is Jewelry Bonney? Now, some of you might jump at this and point to Volume 68's SBS, where it was stated that before the time skip, Bonney was 22 years old, making her 24 in the present day. But you may have also jumped over the part where it was stated that it was purely an estimation based on her appearance due to her powers being able to alter her age. In the most recent arc of One Piece, the Egghead arc, fans have taken note that several characters refer to her as a young child or a young girl, and this has caused a bit of controversy surrounding her character. You see, in theory, it would be a huge twist if a character was actually a child this whole time, and we just didn't know. But in this instance, it would be in very, very poor taste. Across the series and across merchandising, Bonney has been depicted in some fairly lewd or adult ways, and so I shouldn't really have to explain why it would be a very bad move to have this character who has been treated as an object of lust over the years to be revealed as an actual child. Now, whatever the case may be, one thing for certain is that there is a lot of evidence in the series that conflicts or paints an unclear picture of what her true age is. Bonney's age has been purposely obfuscated as a plot point to create this discussion over these past chapters of the Egghead arc. And with where we are in the series, I think there are actually more options for the outcome of this mystery aside from her either being an adult or being a child, and we'll talk about that later in the video. For now, I wanted to go through and consider all of the evidence we have that deals with her age. And given what we know so far, you'll see that this takes us on quite a journey of piecing together the timeline for a handful of characters that aren't even directly related to Bonney. Just to offer a disclaimer, the logic we'll be using in this video is contingent on the information currently offered as of chapter 1093. There definitely could be new reveals in the future that completely change the trajectory of some of the deductions we make in this video, and that's fine. After all, this is just a fun exploration of what we know and what could be. So, the most straightforward points I've seen asserting that Bonney is a child have to do with how Vegapunk and Saturn refer to her. Let's start with Vegapunk. Vegapunk in the most recent chapter called her a little child, in the official English translation by Viz. However, in the original Japanese, it seems that the specific verbiage refers to a girl who was a child in the more literal sense. Vegapunk also got angered that Franky, who was a grown man, would let harm fall upon Bonney, which isn't unreasonable if he just cares about Bonney. However, it is particularly interesting to call out Franky for being a grown man in relation to Bonney. Now, we've seen Vegapunk express this kind of concern before as well, such as when he was tricked into thinking Bonney was injured. Interesting to note that she assumed the form of a child here, perhaps just to play into her trick, but there is also the possibility that Vegapunk would know her powers would revert to her true form should she no longer be able to maintain them. Now, Saturn has referred to her as just a girl, which isn't too unreasonable either, especially given that to people like him and Vegapunk, someone like Bonney would be considered a young girl as well. However, we've seen the elders refer to Nico Robin as a woman, and she isn't too much older than Bonney. The logic people have been asserting to make sense of Saturn knowing that she is a child is that there seems to be something that the world government knows about Bonney and that they at one point were concerned over, as evidenced by Akai Inu's exchange with her right before the time skip when she was captured by Blackbeard, who, by the way, also refers to her as a young girl, but this could also just be another instance of an older man talking down on her. The other big thing that people like to point to is that Bonney was found in the water as a child at the start of this arc. Now, we don't have a hard explicit rule on how seawater nullifies devil fruit powers. We've seen some instances where they don't fully nullify the powers at all, such as with Luffy retaining his rubber body underwater, or Chopper not reverting to his animal form when underwater, but there are some instances where seawater will negate powers such as with Moria's abilities. It's hard to say for certain, so I can see why this assertion is made. There's also the idea that Bonney has been shown to be overly expressive, similar to how a child may react, such as when seeing Kuma on several occasions, as well as her excessive reaction to seeing insects. I could see this being the case, but it's also important to realize that this is just potentially characterization for Bonney as well. But with these observations out of the way, I would like to take a deeper look into the timeline and piece together some of the logic to figure out what Oda is actually doing here. In chapter 1063, we got a glimpse of a flashback showing us a young Bonney with a young Kuma, and the most notable part of this was that Kuma did not have his iconic bear ears that looked to actually just be part of his hair, as evidenced by how S-Bear's bear ears are white like Lunarian hair is. Kuma had a shaved head as a child, as seen from his memories later in this arc as well as his depiction in the SBS, and the earliest known instance of him having these bear ears in his hair was 22 years ago when he was a founding member of the Revolutionary Army, as we learned from Vegapunk's flashback to Ohara. So this depiction of a young Bonney with Kuma is likely from at least 22 years ago. If Bonney's presumed age is actually 24, then this would somewhat line up, as she could definitely be 2 years old in this flashback. Alright, I guess that solves it. Case closed, right? And with that said, thank you so much for watching, stay safe, and I hope to see you. I'm just kidding. Bonney mentions that she's been to Egghead before, which opens up a bunch of questions. So in chapter 1062, Bonney said that she had been to Egghead before when she was a kid, but back then it was a normal lab. Now it's hard to know exactly what she means by normal lab, but there are a few things that we can deduce. There weren't any of these hologram creatures back then, as she was deceived by them when she arrived on the island. And the Vegapunk satellites didn't exist, as she did not recognize Atlas. In fact, we may be able to assume the satellites are a fairly recent creation, as Robin was not aware of them either, and she spent 2 years with Dragon, who we've seen speak to Shaka. Also, we even saw Cypher Pol Zero, the highest intelligence agency in the world, being debriefed on the satellites, making me think they're a fairly new thing. So if she is actually her presumed age of 24, then she was probably at Egghead around 2 decades ago. But that begs the question, was Egghead even around back then? Well, there's another person in this arc who claims they've been to Egghead before, and that's Stussy. When Lucci calls out that she seems to know a lot about Egghead, Stussy confirms this and says that she hasn't been here in ages. If this is true, and she was here a long time ago, then she shouldn't be familiar with the things that we've deduced to be more recent additions, such as the hologram creatures and even the Frontier Dome that the rest of the Cypherpol agents weren't aware of. And while Cypherpol was debriefed on the satellite's existence prior to arriving on the island, Stussy is the one who recognizes Atlas by appearance. Now, since we know from Bonney that the lab didn't have these things when she was a child, then Stussy having been here a long time ago would not be relevant to her knowing about the current ongoings of the island. Of course, we would later find out in this arc that Stussy was actually loyal to Vegapunk this whole time, with her being a clone of Miss Buckingham Stussy, which explains why she would be familiar with all of these things, as she would be keeping in touch with Vegapunk. But then this could just mean that she's claiming to have been on Egghead a long time ago to Lucci to cover up why she would know about the island in the present day. So if we follow this logic, Stussy is not necessarily a reliable indicator of the lab on Egghead's existence roughly 2 decades ago. Well, in that case, let's consider what Vegapunk was up to back then. From that flashback to the Ohara aftermath, we learned that Vegapunk was the director of Punk Hazard 22 years ago. And from the Punk Hazard arc, we know that Punk Hazard itself was shut down 4 years ago, and we saw Vegapunk briefly during Caesar's flashback on the day the giant explosion took place. So that gives us a small window for his activity on the island. But we can actually determine how far back he was working there from a few other factors. We recently learned that Sentomaru was hired to be Vegapunk's bodyguard when he was just a child, and Kizaru was with them at the time. Now we got a brief glimpse of Kizaru with Sentomaru and Vegapunk in front of some buildings that are styled similarly to the 3rd Research Institute on Punk Hazard. With this flashback, we can deduce that Vegapunk was likely working out of Punk Hazard back then. But when exactly did this take place? So given the fact that Kizaru first joined the Marines when he was 26, we can deduce that this flashback took place at the very most 32 years ago. Another thing to consider here, Kizaru's appearance during these flashbacks matches his depiction on the film Z color spread, where various Marines were drawn at the age they were trained under the non-canon Marine instructor Zephyr. And while their training under Zephyr may not have been canonical, their appearances are, and so we can use this to assume Kizaru met Sentomaru not too long after he joined the Marines. Not only that, we've also seen Kizaru depicted 27 years ago just before the Ed War, as seen in Chapter 0. He's off in the corner of the panel, but this chapter was also animated so we get a better look at him, and you can see he's wearing a suit along with a Marine cap, and him hanging around the big names at Marine headquarters somewhat suggests that he's ranked up by this point, but at the very least, he's taking his appearance a bit more seriously than he did in the past. So this flashback likely took place between 32 and 27 years ago, and I'm thinking it took place closer to 27 years ago given Sentomaru's appearance in the flashback. Sentomaru was born 34 years ago, and his appearance suggests that he's probably at least around 5 years old at the time of meeting Vegapunk. So from that, we have Vegapunk working out of Punk Hazard at most 32 years ago so far. But we can actually even go further back, and for that, we'll need to look at Kaido. We learned that Vegapunk had extracted Kaido's bloodline element in order to create his artificial devil fruit that he had left on Punk Hazard, and we've seen Kaido and King escape from Punk Hazard during their brief flashback, so let's piece this together. The Rocks Pirates disbanded 38 years ago after the God Valley incident, and during Odin's flashback, we learned the remnants of the Rocks Pirates started forming their own crews 33 years ago at the latest. So that gives us a window for when this flashback of King and Kaido escaping took place and when Vegapunk was working out of Punk Hazard. And for the purposes of knowing Vegapunk's time at Punk Hazard, this 30+ year time frame is more than enough. But there is a small detail here that may be able to give us an even more precise estimate. So if you'll join me on this tangent, let's talk about MADS. MADS is, of course, the scientific research team that Vegapunk was a part of before he started working for the government. And from an excerpt of his notes in the Egghead arc, we learned that he was actually the director of MADS as well. During the Germa 66 cover story, we see a glimpse of the formation of MADS with its named members being Vegapunk, Caesar Clown, Vince Smoke Judge, Queen, and a woman who we would come to find out was Miss Buckins, the original Buckingham Stussy. Now, Stussy's inclusion here actually gives us a fairly good estimate as to when MADS was formed, as Stussy was originally a member of the Rocks Pirates as well. So knowing this, we can deduce that at the very least, this entire group that we see on this cover page was together for the first time at least 38 years ago, after the God Valley incident. Which means Vegapunk had not been brought under the world government just yet. Well, what was it that led to MADS being disbanded in the first place? Research on bloodline elements, the blueprints to life itself. We first learn of this back during the Whole Cake Island arc when Sanji is being told of Germa's numerous clones, and during the Egghead arc, we learned that Stussy was the first successful clone experiment to come out of MADS, so it's possible that the successful cloning of a human was what forced the government to intervene and shut down MADS. But the verbiage used here to describe Stussy implies that there may have been failed experiments as well. And so we're going to have to talk about Edward Weevil. Weevil is the alleged biological son of Whitebeard and Miss Buckins, and the idea that Weevil was actually a failed clone of Whitebeard has been around for a while now. It seems even more plausible with Buckin wanting to find her former MADS colleague Vegapunk to prove it, and while it seems extremely likely that Weevil is a failed clone experiment, I just want to remind us that this is all still a working theory and isn't confirmed just yet. But with that said, if he is a failed clone, then his age can give us a hint toward the final years of MADS before it dissolved into the world government. Weevil was said to be 35 years old in the Vivre card database, which suggests that the successful cloning experiment of Stussy took place at most 35 years ago. And this would somewhat line up from what we saw of her appearance in the cover story, as her silhouette seems to resemble the clone Stussy's silhouette in present day, with the clone being in her mid-30s given this logic, and the original Stussy having been about 38 years old when the Rocks Pirates disbanded. So with this, we can get a closer approximation of the span of years that MADS would have been dissolved and Vegapunk would have begun working with the world government, coming in at most 35 years ago and at least 33 years ago, as that was when the remnants of the Rock Pirates were said to have started forming their own crews. Now, this is likely the span of years in which Vegapunk extracted the bloodline elements from a captured Kaido before Kaido escaped Punk Hazard with King. I should note, though, that there's also the chance that Weevil is a failed clone that came after Stussy and was imperfect for whatever reason, perhaps lack of resources, in which case the window shifts by a few years, but in general, it should all still make sense. Okay, so we have established that the approximate time period for Vegapunk to have been active on Punk Hazard, as well as the potential timeline for MADS. But how does this all tie into Egghead's timeline, or even the original question of Bonney's age? Well, indulge me for a second, because we're going to have to use our heads. Well, actually, we're going to have to use Vegapunk's head. From what we've discussed, there isn't any explicit evidence that the lab on Egghead has been around for decades simultaneously with Punk Hazard, aside from the comments from Stussy and Bonney that we discussed earlier. In fact, I think with what we know about Vegapunk working out of Punk Hazard for the majority of the past 3 or so decades, it makes sense to me that he left Punk Hazard after it was closed and then moved to work on Egghead. In fact, one of the defining features of Egghead is the literal egg that's synced up to Vegapunk's head. And I'm talking about Punk Records, of course. And as we've seen throughout the years, Vegapunk did not have his Apple antenna in any of these flashbacks, except in one. In chapter 1072, Vegapunk talks with Kuma at his lab and tells him about the potential abilities of the pawpaw fruit. Now, this scene is likely taking place on Egghead, as Kuma would leave his memories there at some point. So when is this flashback taking place? Well, Punk Hazard closed down 4 years ago, so I would think that he moved to Egghead not too long after that. So that gives us one window. And we see that Kuma is behaving like a human with emotions, even being annoyed at his privacy being intruded upon, so this is likely before any major cyborg operations. Actually, we know for a fact that his arms were the first thing to be weaponized, as explained by Doflamingo during the Marineford arc. And what do you see here? His arms are bandaged up, so this is definitely before any major operations. And if you're not convinced that this is taking place around 4 years prior, just off the idea that this is when Punk Hazard closed down, there's some more circumstantial evidence here. During that brief flashback on Punk Hazard, just before it was closed down, Vegapunk's head is clearly still large and growing, and not yet replaced with the apple antenna that it would have had on Egghead. Furthermore, Kuma struck a deal to become a government weapon and in turn a warlord of the sea. So to figure out when this started, we can look at the history of the warlord system. Now, this is actually a topic that I plan on doing an in-depth video about at some point, but the abbreviated version of it is that all of the original warlords attained the status more than a decade ago, at least, aside from Kuma and Mihawk. We don't actually have much to go off of on Mihawk's history, but we know Kuma was likely the most recent one, as his membership was contingent on him becoming a cyborg, which was only complete by the time of the Marineford War. Kuma was also part of the Revolutionaries at least 12 years ago, as we saw him at Grey Terminal during the Ace Sabo Luffy flashback, and his activity after that is not as clear, but we do know that there was a vacancy in the warlord system 4 years ago, as we saw in the canon Ace novel when he was offered a spot on the roster but turned it down. Now, this vacancy lines up perfectly with when Punk Hazard closed down, and what we assume was when Vegapunk relocated to Egghead. Again, this is not confirmation, but the pieces do seem to fit very well. Okay, so we have a good suspicion that the lab on Egghead has been around for at least 4 years, and we don't have much evidence that it's been around before that, except when Bonney said she was there as a kid. And if we stopped our investigation here, we could posit that Bonney was only actually here within the last 4 years, and conclude that she's actually a child. But I don't think that's necessarily the case. Let's go back to using Vegapunk's head, but more literally. In Chapter 1067, we learn Bonney's aware of Vegapunk's giant head. Vegapunk even mentions that when they first met, his head was going to be as tall as a giant pretty soon. Now, this is probably just a figure of speech, but for the sake of being thorough, I averaged the height of every giant whose height we have access to, excluding the outliers such as that massive ancient giants like Ors or whatever the Yeti Cool brothers are, or even Sanwan Wolf, whose known height is his maximum height thanks to his powers, and this average comes out to roughly 18.99 meters, or about 62 feet. Now, I'll be the first one to say, this methodology is pretty pointless, as we know Oda is not always consistent when it comes to things like scale, but let's see what we can do with this. When we first saw him with Kizaru and Sentomaru, his head appears to be at least twice the size of Kizaru, who is roughly 3 meters or about 10 feet tall. And when he's with Dragon 22 years ago, in some panels, it looks much larger than Dragon, who was 2.5 meters or 8.5 feet tall, but from a different perspective, it looks only a little bit taller. Now, like I said, this is probably a fruitless effort. Though, when we see him with Elbaf with Saul, his head looks to be close to the size of a sitting giant, and that would track if he really did read all the books and took in all that information. And for the record, Saul is 19.5 meters tall, which translates to about 64 feet. So hey, in theory, you could take this as evidence for the time period for when Bonney and Vegapunk first met, which loosely lines up with the idea that Bonney is in her early to mid-20s. Now, we may have some evidence for Bonney meeting Vegapunk 2 decades ago here, implying that she is actually a 20-something-year-old. But what about Egghead? Now, there is one last thing that I've been holding out on, and it's important that we consider. The Iron Giant. This giant robot that attacked Marijoa 200 years ago and was ordered by the world government to be dismantled and destroyed. However, the scientists tasked with this chose not to, and instead hid it on this island that would come to be known as Egghead. Now, this is clear evidence that this island existed more than 2 decades ago. But what about the lab that Bonney would have seen as a kid? Well, if there were scientists here who hid the Iron Giant for 200 years, then it's not too unreasonable to assume that there was a lab here during that period before Vegapunk took over, and built what would be known as Egghead. But even so, this doesn't actually address why Bonney would be here to begin with 20-some years ago, when her father was a revolutionary. Well, we've seen Dragon and Vegapunk maintain contact over the years, and during the flashback, Vegapunk mentioned some greater goal, so it's very possible that the Revolutionary Army has been working in conjunction with Vegapunk over the past decades in some capacity, and this could end up with Kuma and Bonney visiting the island at some point. But I don't want to get into the conjecture territory with reasons and motivations. The point of this was to examine the evidence for and against Bonney being 20-some years old with respect to the timeline of events that we can piece together. And ultimately, I feel like there is some solid evidence that Bonney has been around for the past 2 decades and that a lab on Egghead existed. But if things are this clear-cut, then why go through all of this trouble to try and sway some readers into thinking that she's a child with the various instances that we went over at the start of this video? Well, in classic Oda fashion, when there are 2 options presented to us, there's a good chance that there's a third one waiting to blow us away. And so I'd like to briefly discuss the possibility of Bonney being a clone. Now, this idea has been around for a while now, especially ever since the idea of cloning some former Rocks pirates came to light with Stussy and Buckin, and perhaps even Weevil and Whitebeard. There has been some speculation that Bonney is a clone of Big Mom because of how similar both Big Mom and Bonney looked at the age of 24, along with their eating habits, but I don't want to speculate on that potential theory as much as I want to talk about how the idea of Bonney being a clone would be a decent way to subvert the established expectations of her either being an adult or a child in general. Now, the chapter that we first learned about Stussy being a clone started out with some notes from Vegapunk while he was the director of MADS, and the person he's referring to is suggested to be Stussy, as we find out by the end of the chapter. But it is interesting to consider if this is actually supposed to be intended for Bonney, who we focus on in her child form as the chapter starts. But as I established earlier in the video, it's unlikely for Vegapunk to have been working with MADS between 2 and 3 decades ago. And maybe we'll get new information that contradicts this working timeline and allows it to be the case, but until then, I'm not completely sure. Also, Kuma was born 47 years ago, so he wouldn't even be a full adult until after MADS was disbanded. So I suppose it is possible that Bonney isn't necessarily Kuma's biological daughter. After all, the two look nothing alike, and while Vegapunk was interested in Kuma's physicality due to him being part of a special people, he doesn't seem to be too interested in Bonney aside from his concern for her well-being. All that said, we know Bonney has a memory of Kuma holding her up as a child, and this is likely taking place before Kuma joined the Revolutionaries, as he did not have as bare ears that he did when the Revolutionary Army was initially formed. But what's to say that's her memory? What if that's the memory of the original Bonney that was extracted by Kuma's powers and given to the current Bonney? There could be some strange possibility where Kuma's original daughter was on the brink of death, and Vegapunk agreed to clone her for Kuma. If Kuma is able to push out people's memories, then perhaps he's able to provide the cloned Bonney some of the original Bonney's memories with Kuma. Now, this is a bit far-fetched, I'll admit it myself, but it would allow Oda to have this Bonney be however many years old, while allowing her to be the full-fledged adult. As we've seen from Germa's cloning tech, they can create a 20-year-old clone in just 5 years, and if something similar is happening with Bonney, then that would explain why certain people refer to her as a child, even if she is in actuality in her mid-20s. But I doubt it, and that's just one potential direction for this mystery. This is definitely one of Oda's strangest plot points yet, and I'm curious to see how this plays out. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of the various timelines and the possibilities that surround the question of how old Jewelry Bonney actually is. I could have made a shorter theory video about any of these possibilities, but I find it more interesting to talk through as many of them as we can. There's enough evidence for support seeded into the story to argue whichever way, so why double down on one when we can discuss the logic for all of the possibilities? And this is definitely a different kind of video for my channel, where I mainly do explicit breakdowns, but I felt like doing an exploration of this theory or question, and I thought it'd be interesting. Let me know if you liked it, and I apologize if some of it felt a little too loose or rambly. There's just a lot of jumping off points in this discussion, especially in a series like One Piece. And with that said, thank you so much for watching, stay safe, and I hope to see you in the next one.